Hi, my name is Jake Marcinko, and I'm a Senior Technical Product Manager for the PCI Security Standards Council. And I'm one of the internal champions driving the PCI SSC Standard Modernization Initiative. It's kind of a mouthful. So during today's session, what we want to do is we want to explain what the standards modernization effort is, why it's important, and what we hope to achieve through this effort. But before we can address these questions, we really need to explain how the PCI SSC's proverbial sausage is currently made. In other words, we need to understand the current process for how standards and their supporting documentation are brought to market. But it all starts with this guy. Anyone? Does he look familiar to anyone? Most of you look to be about my age, so he has a famous cousin. Anyone? Bill. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. Bonus points to you if you can sing the song that he's famous for. Okay. No, for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, it was a show called Schoolhouse Rock back in the 80s that used to talk about different educational things, and one of them was how a bill becomes a law. And I chose this character because I think the ways that standards and documentation are brought to market are very similar in terms of the complexity of the process to how a bill becomes a law in the US. So the standards development process typically originates within a PCI SSC working group. Those working groups develop and refine internal drafts until they reach consensus on a version that they're comfortable sending out to the industry for feedback. Now, once consensus is reached, the draft documents are then shared with our stakeholders through the RFC process. These groups, most of you in fact, provide their ideas and feedback back to, on the draft standards back to the council. This information then goes back to the working group, and they consider whether and how to incorporate the feedback into a subsequent draft. Now, the whole process repeats itself until the working group gets to a point where they're comfortable with the draft document and they're ready to publish it to the website. But before a standard can be published or any documentation can be published, it has to go through a series of internal approvals. Once it has achieved the necessary approvals, it can then be published to the PCI SSC website. So now that we understand the general process for bringing a standard to market, now let's look at some of the ingredients that go into producing a standard. So most of our standards start out as Microsoft Word documents within the working groups. These documents are then converted to PDF before they're either shared with the stakeholders through the RFC process or they go through the internal approval process and are then published to the PCI SSC website. Now, this approach presents several challenges. One of those challenges is potential data loss. So when you convert documents from one format to another, like Word to PDF, this sometimes results in content loss or unintended content transformations. Things like headers, footers, fonts, or other formatting elements do not always convert very well. Now, while loss of certain formatting elements may not seem like a big problem to you, the loss of semantic enrichment elements like bookmarks, hyperlinks, footnotes, these can be a bit more problematic. Another potential issue is usability. Now, there are really two subcategories of usability issues, accessibility and interpretability. Now, there's one page in PCI DSS that I think does a fantastic job of demonstrating these issues. So how many of you are familiar with this page in PCI DSS? Okay. Not very many, actually. That's a little surprising. This actually is my favorite page in the entire standard because of what it's trying to do and what it actually achieves. It's providing metadata about the layout of the standard and how that information is intended to be interpreted. However, this also presents a couple of challenges. First of all, machine interpretability. Now, one of the issues with our standards today is that they generally assume the consumer of that documentation is a human. And with the increased adoption of automation and AI, that is no longer a reasonable assumption. Some computers also struggle with processing information and images and applying contextual metadata described in this image and applying it to the rest of the document. That can be challenging for some computer systems, including AI. But this page is also a challenge to human users with disabilities. For example, the color codings around the image. Colorblind people may not be able to differentiate between minor color variations or process what the colors are intended to represent. Use of complex layouts like this page here are also tough with people with autism or dyslexia. And also users with dyslexia often struggle with taking information in one section of a document and then trying to apply it throughout the document. So what's the solution? Anyone? XML. XML is the solution, and I'll explain to why that's the case. But as most of you know that have been in this industry for a while, the folks that are behind, that are helping to author these documents aren't necessarily experts in XML. Fortunately, there's a whole suite of tools that are emerging on the market to help generate XML versions of documents simultaneously while they're being authored, without the authors themselves having to know or be familiar with XML. Now, what does XML do for us? Well, it enables us to convert to other formats without data loss. And the reason for this is because instead of starting out with a proprietary format, you're starting out with an open, machine-readable format. XML source files do a better job of supporting conversion to other machine-friendly formats. It also paves the way for us to do more significant things like creating web-based versions of our standards and documentations, or producing more accessibly friendly formats. So where are we with our effort today? Well, we are currently in the process of analyzing our content across PCI DSS to start, but we're also working with other standards. And we're mapping this information to a universal set of semantic tags. Now, this is an intermediate step between going from Word to going to XML. And the reason, well, let me advance this. The reason for this is that by going to an intermediate step, we can map all of the content across all of our documents to a universal set. From there, we can then go to any XML schema of choice. Without, the alternative to that would be going from every single standard or document that we have and mapping that to the XML schema. So this is a much easier way to go about that. Now, current timelines, right now we're in phase 1, which, as I mentioned, we're taking PCI DSS version 4.0.1, and we are creating an XML version of that standard. Now, we're doing it using a custom XML schema, and we anticipate having that document ready for pilot, or for folks to start utilizing that by the end of this year. And we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, I think, on that. Phase 1 also involves us looking at those authoring tools that I mentioned earlier to help us kind of plan for the future of how we're going to produce XML versions of these documents at scale. Now, phase 2, we'll start to look at, as I mentioned, other standards. Now, we haven't identified exactly what that is, but we are planning on expanding this process beyond PCI DSS to include not only other standards, but other documentation as well. And I already know what question that some of you are already about to ask me. Does that include reporting templates? And the answer to that is yes. We are going to work to produce XML version of our reporting templates and attestation forms. The timelines for that are a little bit longer, though, because we have to produce an XML version of standard, start to test that schema with other standards, and that before we would feel comfortable going and starting to work on the ROC templates. Now, again, these three phases are displayed across a single year timeline. That's currently what we have planned. But again, I think the reality is as we get deeper into this effort, it's likely that these timelines may change. They may shift left, but they may also shift right. If you have any questions about this initiative and why we're doing this and how we're going about this, please feel free to grab me during the conference. If by chance you don't have an opportunity, we don't have an opportunity to talk, please send an email to this email address here. Myself and others, including Andrew, have access to this, and we will respond to your query as quickly as possible. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope this was informative, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, everyone.